The morning light filtered gently through the windows of a small café in the heart of Paris, casting soft shadows across the wooden tables. It was an ordinary day, the familiar hum of clinking cups and quiet conversations filling the air. Then a frail figure stepped through the door, disrupting the café's peaceful rhythm. Alain Dupont, at 89, moved slowly, his steps labored from the weight of the years and the burdens he carried. His coat was frayed, his shoes worn thin, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a few coins. With weary eyes, he approached the counter, his voice barely audible as he asked, "Could I have a small sandwich, please?" The café owner, Marguerite, glanced at him with a mix of impatience and disdain. She was known for her strict temperament and kept her café orderly and refined, disliking any disturbance. Alain's appearance seemed like a stain in her pristine establishment. She looked him up and down before scoffing. "We don't serve charity here, old man. If you don't have enough, there's nothing for you." Alain's face fell, but he didn't move. His eyes were cast down, ashamed, but hunger held him there. For a moment he looked around the café, catching the disapproving stares of the other patrons. He felt the weight of humiliation pressing down on him, and he wondered if he should simply turn and leave. But in a corner of the café sat a woman, elegantly dressed and watching the exchange with growing anger. Her name was Elise Laurent, a woman of wealth and influence, known for her quiet compassion and discerning eye. She noted every detail, the faded clothes, Alain's trembling hands, and the unmistakable glint of a watch on his wrist, a watch that was hauntingly familiar. Elise's heart raced, memories flashing through her mind, and without another thought, she rose from her seat and walked toward the counter. Marguerite's expression shifted immediately as Elise approached, her confidence faltering in the presence of this well-known woman. "What's the problem here?" Elise asked, her voice calm but laced with disapproval. Marguerite stammered, He doesn't have enough money." Elise's gaze softened as she looked at Alain, who was now frozen, uncertainty in his eyes. She extended her hand and said gently, "Today your lunch is on me." Alain looked up in disbelief, a glimmer of hope replacing the sadness in his eyes. Elise turned to Marguerite, her tone firm. "This man has the same right to be here as any other customer. Treat him with dignity." Marguerite huffed, attempting to save face. "Fine, if that's what you want." Elise gave Alain a reassuring smile. "Come, sit. I'll join you." As they sat down, the watch on Alain's wrist caught Elise's eye again. Her heart skipped a beat as a long-buried memory surfaced. The watch was identical to one she had given to someone dear to her, someone she'd loved and lost. It couldn't be. Yet here it was, worn by a stranger who felt like anything but. Elise studied the watch on Alain's wrist, the familiar shape and engravings bringing a surge of emotion she had buried long ago. She struggled to steady herself, but her voice trembled as she asked, "Sir, may I look at your watch?" Alain blinked, confused but slowly nodded. His fingers shook as he unfastened the strap, passing it to her as if entrusting her with something precious. "It's just an old keepsake," he said softly, "from someone who mattered very much to me, my son, Gabriel." Elise's hand froze as she turned the watch over, her breath catching at the sight of a delicate engraving on the back. Gabriel. The world around her blurred, and she clutched the watch tightly, its cold metal feeling like a direct line to memories she thought she'd lost. "Gabriel?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hands shook, and she placed the watch down carefully on the table, as though it might shatter from her touch. Alain, sensing the change in her, watched with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Did you know my son?" His voice was soft, hesitant, as if asking might break the frail hope rising in his chest. Elise closed her eyes, memories flooding back of a young man filled with warmth and laughter. He'd come to her boutique every week with donations for the orphanage nearby, the very orphanage where she'd grown up. She remembered the way he'd listen as she spoke, how he'd dream with her of futures that felt endless and full. Yes, she finally whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Gabriel was everything to me. I loved him more than anything. Alain's face softened, surprise and sadness filling his weary eyes. His gaze dropped to the table, and he spoke slowly, as though piecing together fragments of a story he had never fully understood. I didn't know about that part of his life, he murmured. After he passed, his mother Vivienne always blamed someone. She said he drifted from us because of a woman, but she never told me who. All I knew was that, after he died, life was never the same. Elise winced at the mention of Vivienne, Gabriel's mother. She recalled the disapproving looks, the curt exchanges whenever they'd met. Vivienne, who held unrelenting expectations, had never accepted her, never thought Elise was good enough for her son. Vivienne never accepted me, Elise admitted, her voice steady yet tinged with pain. Gabriel was torn between us, struggling to please her while wanting to live his own life. It was difficult for him. Alain nodded, his expression one of regret. He looked away, out the window, as if to see beyond the years that had divided them from Gabriel. She convinced me too, he whispered. For a long time I thought you were to blame. His words hit Elise with the weight of years of misunderstanding, but she took a steady breath, allowing compassion to fill her heart. None of this was your fault, she said softly, or mine. Gabriel loved us both, and he carried that love with him through it all. What happened was an accident. It took us all by surprise. Alain's hands trembled as he placed them on the table, his eyes glistening. Meeting you today, finding this piece of Gabriel, it means more than I can say. His voice was full of vulnerability, a father's grief mingling with the surprise of shared love. They sat in silence for a moment, heavy with years of unspoken loss, but for the first time, they both felt a little less alone. Elise handed the watch back, and Alain carefully slipped it onto his wrist, feeling its familiar weight. As they looked at each other, an unspoken bond formed between them, tethered by love and loss. Alain held the watch on his wrist, feeling its weight as if Gabriel himself was there beside him. The café, once filled with murmurs and casual glances, now seemed silent, as though it, too, respected the moment between these two souls connected by their love for the same person. Elise glanced around, her gaze settling on the distant memory of Gabriel. She broke the silence, her voice soft. I grew up in the orphanage near here. Gabriel used to visit every week. He'd bring books and supplies, and spent hours talking to us, especially me. He believed in second chances, in helping others. I think that's why he tried so hard to bridge the gap with his family. Alain listened, his expression caught between wonder and regret. Vivienne wanted him to marry someone of status, someone who could elevate us, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She wanted the best for him, and I thought that was love. But now, looking back, I can see how Gabriel was caught in a struggle between our expectations and his own dreams. Elise's eyes softened. I know. He never wanted to disappoint anyone, and he never said a word to make me feel any less, even when I sensed how difficult it was for him to be torn between us. She paused, a faint smile appearing as she recalled Gabriel's gentle spirit. He was so full of life and kindness, as if he wanted to give the world more than he took. Alain lowered his head, sorrow washing over him. After the accident, Vivienne and I grew distant. She became wrapped up in her grief, and I. He hesitated, his voice breaking. I didn't know how to move on. The emptiness he left was unbearable. Elise reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. Grief does that. It isolates us, makes us feel like no one else can understand our pain. But meeting you, Alain, it feels like a small piece of Gabriel has come back to life. He squeezed her hand, nodding slowly. You're right. For the first time since he left, I feel not alone in this. He took a shaky breath, finding comfort in her presence. I'm sorry, Elise, for blaming you, for believing the worst when Gabriel loved you with all his heart. Elise's eyes brimmed with unshed tears, but she held them back, managing a gentle smile. Thank you, Alain. I think it's time for all of us to forgive ourselves and each other. Gabriel would want us to find peace, to let go of all that's kept us apart. They shared a quiet moment of mutual understanding, feeling the past begin to loosen its grip on them. Together, they had a chance to honor Gabriel's memory, not by holding on to the sorrow, but by embracing the love he left behind. It was perhaps the greatest gift he could have given them. Alain sat back in his chair, absorbing the weight of Elise's words. The memories they shared, once painful, seemed now to be transformed into a shared solace. He looked around the café, the familiar surroundings feeling somehow new, as if Gabriel's presence had breathed life back into him. After a while, Elise broke the silence, her tone calm yet resolute. Alain, there's something I need to ask. How did you end up here, like this? She gestured subtly toward his worn clothes and frail appearance, careful not to offend. Alain exhaled slowly, his eyes clouding with the shadows of his past. After Gabriel's passing, Vivienne and I could never look at each other the same. Blame lingered between us, like an unwelcome guest that never left. She blamed me for not stopping him, for not forcing him to stay closer to the family. And I blamed myself too. We both did. I thought maybe she was right, that if I had been firmer, things would have been different. Elise's heart clenched at the self-blame in his voice. She recognized the weight he carried, one she had struggled with herself for years. Sometimes, we think if we hold on to guilt, we're somehow closer to them. But Alain, Gabriel's choices were his own, and they were made with love. None of us could have known what would happen. Alain nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. After a while, Vivienne withdrew entirely, and so did I. The house became empty, hollow. Eventually, I couldn't stay there anymore. It reminded me too much of everything we'd lost. He lowered his gaze, his voice trembling. One day, I left and didn't return. My savings ran out faster than I'd thought, and eventually I found myself on the streets. Elise placed her hand over his, a silent gesture of comfort. No one deserves to live through that alone, Alain. Least of all you. They sat in silence, the weight of his words settling between them. Finally, Alain cleared his throat, the tension softening slightly. And Vivienne, she's nearby. We stay together in the square down by the river. She's even more fragile than I am now. I came here today, hoping to find enough for us both. Elise's face softened, a gentle warmth filling her expression. Alain, I want to help. I don't know if I can mend everything that's broken, but perhaps we can take the first steps. I'd like to meet Vivienne. Maybe together we can all begin to heal. Alain looked at her, a mixture of surprise and gratitude flooding his gaze. I don't know what to say. I never imagined someone would care enough to try. I thought that life had moved on without us. Elise managed a reassuring smile. Life hasn't left you behind, Alain. This moment, right here, is proof of that. For the first time in years, a spark of hope flickered within Alain, small but undeniable. And in Elise's eyes, he found the kindness he thought the world had long forgotten. The sun dipped low, as Alain guided Elise through the winding streets toward the square by the river. In the shade of a large tree, they found Vivienne, her once proud figure now hunched and weary. Her eyes were distant, fixed on the ground, and her hands clutched a small, worn bag. As Alain approached, Vivienne looked up, surprise flashing across her face when she saw Elise. "Alain, who is this?" she asked, her voice brittle. Alain began, voice gentle, "This is Elise. She was important to Gabriel." Vivienne's face hardened at the mention of her son. Her eyes narrowed as she studied Elise, suspicion flickering. "You," she said quietly. "You are the one who took him from us." Elise felt the sting of the accusation but stood her ground, her gaze steady. "I understand that's how you feel," she said softly, "but I'm not here to reopen old wounds. I'm here to help." Vivienne's hands shook as she gripped her bag tighter, pain etched into every line on her face. "I lost everything, because of you, my son, my life." Elise took a steadying breath, meeting Vivienne's pain with compassion. "Gabriel loved you, Vivienne, and he loved me. His death wasn't anyone's fault, but I believe he'd want us to find peace." Vivienne's eyes softened, her defenses wavering. Beside her, Alain took her hand gently, his touch a silent reassurance. After a long pause, Vivienne nodded slowly. Maybe it's time." In that small square, beneath the quiet shade of the tree, a glimmer of healing began. In the days that followed, Elise invited Alain and Vivienne into her home, a modest but welcoming apartment near the river. For Vivienne, it felt strange, even uncomfortable, to accept help from the woman she had once resented so deeply. But Alain's gentle encouragement and Elise's steady kindness softened her resistance. One morning, Elise prepared coffee for the three of them. As she handed a cup to Vivienne, she noticed how her hands trembled as they wrapped around the warmth of the mug. Vivienne stared into the coffee, her voice barely a whisper. "I never thought I would end up here accepting help from you." Elise nodded, understanding. "Neither did I," she admitted. "But life has brought us together again, and maybe this time we can help each other heal." Vivienne looked up, meeting Elise's gaze, a hint of vulnerability showing through. "I didn't understand Gabriel's choices back then. I thought I was protecting him, but I see now that I only drove him away." Her voice cracked and a tear slipped down her cheek. "I blamed you because it was easier than blaming myself." Elise reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Vivienne's. "We both loved him, Vivienne, and I believe he would want us to forgive ourselves and each other." In that quiet moment, the walls between them softened. Vivienne exhaled, the weight of her resentment lifting slightly. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the possibility of healing, knowing she wasn't alone. They sat in silence, sipping their coffee, a fragile truce binding them, grounded in a love that had never truly left. As the days passed, Elise saw a transformation in Alain and Vivienne. Their guarded expressions softened, replaced by a hint of peace that had long eluded them. They spent quiet afternoons sharing memories of Gabriel, laughter mingling with tears as they began to mend the fractured pieces of their hearts. One evening, after a shared dinner, Elise cleared her throat, glancing thoughtfully between the two. "I've been thinking about how I might continue helping. You both deserve a stable place to rebuild your lives. If you're open to it, I'd like to help you find a home of your own." Alain's eyes widened in surprise, gratitude etched across his weathered face. "A home?" he repeated, barely daring to believe it. For years, he had grown accustomed to the transient life of the streets, with no real sense of belonging. Vivienne looked at Elise, hesitation mingling with hope. "After everything, you'd do that for us?" Elise smiled warmly. "I want to. Gabriel meant the world to me, and I believe he'd want us all to move forward together. Finding a place of your own would be a part of that." Vivienne reached for Alain's hand, gripping it tightly. The fear of change lingered, but so did a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. "Maybe it's time," she whispered, glancing at him. "A place where we can feel safe again." Alain nodded, his expression a blend of excitement and apprehension. "We're ready." In that moment, they agreed to take this next step together, united by love, loss, and the strength to begin anew. And for the first time in years, the promise of a real home felt within reach. The search for a new home took time, but Elise dedicated herself fully, scouring the city for a small, comfortable place where Alain and Vivienne could feel secure. Weeks passed, and one day she found a modest cottage nestled in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It was simple but charming, with ivy climbing the walls and a small garden in the back. Elise knew instantly that it was the place where Alain and Vivienne could start over. Elise drove them to see it, her heart brimming with hope as she parked outside the cottage. Alon stepped out of the car slowly, his eyes widening as he took in the little house. Vivienne followed, her breath catching as she gazed at the ivy-covered walls and the sunlight filtering through the trees. "It's beautiful," Vivienne murmured, her voice filled with wonder. She turned to Elise, a glimmer of excitement sparking in her eyes. "You found this for us?" Elise nodded, smiling. "This is for you both. A fresh start, a chance to build something new. I want you to feel at home here." They walked through the front door, exploring the cozy rooms with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The living room was modest, with large windows that let in warm, golden light. The kitchen, though small, was perfect for the two of them, and the garden out back was overgrown with wildflowers, just waiting for someone to tend to it. Alon ran his fingers along the window ledge, his expression softened by nostalgia. "I never thought I'd have a place like this again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been dreaming of a home for so long, and here it is, thanks to you." Elise felt her own heart swell. "You both deserve it," she replied gently. "I'll help with whatever you need, but this is your space, your chance to make new memories." Vivienne lingered in the doorway, taking it all in. Her gaze landed on Alon, who was already envisioning where they might place a table or hang a painting. For a moment, the weight of the past lifted, replaced by a sense of quiet possibility. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elise stayed to help them settle in. Together, they arranged a few pieces of donated furniture, set up the kitchen, and brought in the small belongings Alon and Vivienne had managed to keep through the years. They worked in comfortable silence, each small act of organization feeling like a step toward reclaiming their lives. When everything was finally in place, the three of them stood in the center of the living room, admiring their work. Alon took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of standing within walls he could now call his own. He turned to Elise, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "You've given us a new beginning, Elise. We can never repay you for this." Elise shook her head, smiling. "Just live here with joy, with peace. That's all the thanks I need." Vivienne reached out, pulling Elise into a gentle embrace. "Thank you, Elise, for helping us find our way back to life." As they shared a final hug, a profound sense of belonging filled the little house. Alon and Vivienne had finally found their home. In the days that followed, Alon and Vivienne began to find their rhythm in the small cottage. Each morning, sunlight filtered through their windows, filling the rooms with a gentle warmth they hadn't known for years. Alon enjoyed simple routines, opening the windows to let in the morning air, brewing coffee in the tiny kitchen, and watching birds flit around the garden. For Vivienne, the house was a refuge, a place where the shadows of grief gradually softened. She found herself drawn to the garden, tending to the overgrown wildflowers and pulling weeds from between stones. Slowly, the neglected space began to flourish, reflecting her own quiet transformation. Elise visited often, bringing small gifts to brighten their home. A vase of fresh flowers, a few novels, or ingredients for a special meal. Her presence became a familiar comfort, a reminder that they were no longer alone in the world. One afternoon, as the three shared tea in the garden, Alon looked around with a grateful smile. "I didn't think I'd ever feel peace like this again," he admitted, glancing at Vivienne, who nodded in agreement. "It's as if Gabriel is here with us, in every quiet moment." Vivienne looked at Elise, her expression softened by time and understanding. "You've given us more than a home, Elise. You've helped us find each other again." Elise reached over, gently squeezing Vivienne's hand. "We're all family now. This is just the beginning." In their small sunlit garden, they shared a silence that was no longer heavy with loss, but full of gratitude. For the past they had survived, and the future they were now ready to embrace together. Months passed, and the seasons began to change. The little cottage, once a symbol of uncertainty, had transformed into a place of warmth, laughter, and healing. Alain and Vivienne had truly settled into their new life, filling each day with small routines and tender moments that had once seemed lost to them. On a bright spring afternoon, Elise invited Alain and Vivienne to her home for a special gathering. They arrived to find a beautifully prepared lunch in the garden, and Elise, with a smile, introduced them to her son, Nicolas, a young man with warm eyes and a gentle nature. He greeted them with kindness, quickly engaging them in conversation. Throughout the afternoon, laughter filled the garden as they shared stories and memories, some bittersweet, others full of newfound hope. Alain and Vivienne marveled at the ease with which Nicolas welcomed them, treating them as family. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Alain looked around, taking in the faces of his new family. He felt a peace that had eluded him for so long. "Gabriel's memory has brought us together," he said quietly, "but it's the love we found here that keeps us moving forward." Vivienne nodded, a gentle smile on her face. "I never thought I could feel this kind of happiness again," she murmured, reaching for Elise's hand. "Thank you, Elise, for giving us a place to belong." Elise squeezed her hand warmly, her voice full of emotion. "We're all connected, through Gabriel and beyond, and from here on, we'll build our own memories together." They embraced, each of them feeling the completeness of a journey marked by pain but ending in love and unity. Together they had become a family, woven together by the threads of loss, forgiveness, and hope for the future. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos.